I'm a former policymaker in the
Excellent.
UK civil service and now a senior fellow at the UK's Institute for Government, a non-partisan charity. In the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at how governments use data to make policy and how they should use data to make policy. Those may not be quite the same thing. So we're looking to close that gap. I've got a fantastic panel. Please post your questions to them as soon as you like, and we'll allow loads of time to get through them. So joining me are Laura Gilbert, Director of Data Science at 10 Downing Street. I think it's fair to say Laura is the first ever Director of Data Science in 10 Downing Street. That's the Prime Minister's office, for those of you who don't know, behind that black front door. So she's going to join us. She's quite a recent recruit. Then we've got Aidan Eyakuze, Executive Director of Twaweza in East Africa. Apologies to everybody there for my pronunciation. But Aidan's going to bring in a civil society perspective. And then to keep us honest, we have Mevan Babakar. Mevan's Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Chief Executive Officer of FullFact, the UK's leading independent fact-checking charity, but also part of a big worldwide network of fact checkers. And Mevan's been particularly instrumental in developing capacity for automated fact checking. So we're going to start off with a couple of questions from me. We'll have very snappy answers because we've only got 45 minutes. So we want to make this pacey and fun and informative. So Laura, as I said, you've just been recently recruited into the Prime Minister's office to help government up its data game. So what are your first impressions of how government uses data, and what are you focusing on as room for improvement?
It's obviously a very exciting time to be in government and working with data in general. And it's a very good place to be a data scientist because there's a very great deal of different types of data coming through, from sort of very well measured numeric to quite social sort of levels that we can look at. But there's a lot of work that we can do. There's a huge drive at the moment to improve the use of evidence and the transparency of evidence and the quality of data in government decision making, which is why this role and the team has been set up to really push this sort of process forward at the moment. So it's very exciting for us. There's a lot of work to be done. This is a very old system with a lot of processes in place, obviously, and it's always difficult to really change a huge system. It tends to run behind the times. It's built on quite an old technology stack. There's a very massive government-wide drive to reduce reliance on legacy technology, to increase the data flow between departments. But there's still a lot of work to do on that. There are always questions around data ownership, privacy, what data can legally or ethically be shared and what can't. There are some questions which are more difficult than you'd think, whereby you can even take depersonalized data from one department, and if you release that data set with depersonalized data from another department, even though separately they're harmless, it's possible to identify individuals if you then plug those together. So there's a lot around being very careful not to put people at risk. But at the same time, moving forward, we're very, very keen to have a lot more evidence base in everything we do, including the idea of sort of making sure that metrics are included in policy decisions going forward. So you have a better idea of how well your policies are doing. There's more experimentation going in. We have a good way to measure how well things are running as they go along. We're really trying to push the idea of more data transparency and more evidence transparency from the centre. So we're also hiring, if anyone's interested, so get in touch.
Okay, so there's a very useful job ad there from Laura. So that's the sort of perspective from the inside. I'm going to go to Aidan now. Aidan, what does it look like when you're trying to influence government using data, but coming at it from the outside? Aidan.
It can look incredibly daunting, Jill. But what we try to do is to tell stories, really use data to persuade government officials, policymakers, mid-levels, technocrats to take decisions, move resources around in a way that hopefully will achieve the aims of both the civil society and the government in a particular direction. So maybe I should try and be more concrete with a couple of examples. A few years ago, about 10 years ago, we embarked on a huge data collection exercise in East Africa. And we wanted to really ask the question, and this was the narrative we wanted to engage with: are our children learning? There's a huge amount of investment that society, both government, parents, and others, place in educating children, especially primary education. But we weren't sure that the children were learning. And remember, if you go back to the Millennium Goals, the key metric was everybody should have access to education. And in Tanzania, we achieved it. Boys and girls were enrolled in primary education, but were they learning? So we collected a lot of data to try and answer that question. And quite often the answer was not necessarily what the government wanted to hear. And so they questioned it and queried it a lot. How can you collect this data? We used volunteers to collect the data. They said, how can volunteers assess children? But we had a very robust mechanism for doing that. And we showed that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 kids would go through the entire 7 years of primary education and come out at the other end, for all intents and purposes, illiterate and innumerate. This was not liked very much. But come 2012, 2013, and our 4th form exams were the worst in Tanzania for a very, very long time. And I think suddenly there things clicked, and the government said, "Oh, maybe you were onto something with your early grade assessment on whether our children were learning or not." And so that issue, that question of focusing on learning outcomes based on the data that we had collected, became important. And a lot of Tanzania's development partners and donors are now focusing on improving learning outcomes, not necessarily putting aside the issue of access to education, but learning outcomes has become really much more important. So, we try to engage with the narrative. We asked a particularly easy question, but hard to answer, and made sure that we had the evidence and the data that was really quite deep and very broad-based to answer that question. So that's what I'm calling a blunt approach to getting government and policymakers to listen to the data. Maybe next time I can tell you about a much more sharper approach. We're actually using experimental data and a randomized controlled trial, again, to help government pay the teachers actually better so that they actually deliver learning outcomes in Tanzania.
I just want to actually throw that point from Aidan back to Laura. Laura, how much use you use of data that's coming at you from outside government as opposed to data that's collected by government? Or is there just so much data within government that that actually don't have that much use for data being fed at you from the outside?
We definitely have a lot of use for data from the outside, particularly from academic institutions. That we use a great deal of research models and data gathering from universities, hospitals, really anyone we can get hold of. I think the blocker tends to come in that, funnily enough, there aren't that many people in any one group working on things. So actually getting a good idea of the visibility of all the data that's available and prioritizing which bits to look at. It's still a system that it's relatively difficult to keep track of everything and make sure you're really prioritizing the right data sets. It's something we work very hard on, but it's not perfect as yet.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to go to Mevan now. Mevan, you've been watching governments using facts and data and calling them out perhaps where they haven't used it as straightforwardly as they might over a long time. So what's your impression? We've heard quite a lot from Laura about aspirations for transparency and communication and making sure stuff's backed up. So how do you think governments handle data and communicate it to the public?
I think that ambition is a great one. I think going more in the direction of transparency is great, but we are a very long way away from that yet. I think that too often politicians come out and use a claim or a number in public life, and that number isn't backed up with numbers in public life. It's always private data sets. I think if I could change one thing in how the government communicates. It's making sure that every single time a claim is made public, the data to back it up is also public. The Office of Statistics Regulation described it as equality of access. And actually, I think it's a really important thing for trust in the modern day. It's not enough to just tell people a number anymore. You have to also explain where that number has come from. And that's how you build trust with an electorate and with the public. So I think that's really important, making sure there's no unpublished data in public life. We've seen too many instances maybe of things being wrong and the record not being corrected. And I think in a functioning democracy, that really has to end. If you get something wrong, there should be mechanisms to correct the record, and that should be made public. And actually, there's good data to suggest that when you correct yourself, that also improves trust. So it's not all downhill when something goes wrong. It's also an opportunity to rebuild. I think that a lot of those are about communicating data, and I think take the pandemic, for example, there's been like a lot of uncertainty in the pandemic, and too often we've been given numbers with great certainty. And I think that was a misstep. I think that we could have done better to say that actually here are the bounds of this number. Take the R number, for example. It was often given as a definitive number and then changed to a range. And I think those kinds of changes, although might seem small, actually communicate something far more complex. And that's really important for people's understanding of really difficult issues.
So Mevan, Mevan, I'm going to come in here because I've got a question from Paul Colville-Nash. Thanks very much, Paul. First question out of the blocks, which goes directly to that. And I just wondered if you and the other panelists might like to comment on it. Paul says, in the drive for data transparency and evidence-based decision-making, hat tip Laura, what have we learnt when the public can't join the dots between complex, even uncertain data presentations and policy development and implementation? I'm going to widen that beyond the public to include parliamentarians, arguably, perhaps even some civil servants and ministers. Mevan, let's go to you first. Do you think that is transparency enough, or how do we help people interpret that data when they all haven't got advanced degrees in statistics and probability or what else you might need? Mevan first, and I'm going to come to our other two panelists.
It starts with having the right measures in the first place. And I think that, sorry, let me start again just because I could hear myself and it was very off-putting. So it starts with having the right measures in the first place. Take, for example, Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer got up in PMQs, and one of them said COVID deaths were going up, one of them said COVID deaths were going down, as is specific to care homes. And they were both right. And they were both right because they were using two different measures. And if you looked at it day to day, one was going up, and if you looked at it week to week, one was going down. So that's not necessarily because somebody has misunderstood that data. It's because there are two different sets of data technically measuring the same thing, but in different ways. And as a member of the public, you'd be looking at that, at Prime Minister's questions and thinking, what on earth is going on here? How could deaths be going up and down at the same time? And I think that the formats that we have do not allow for complexity and nuance a lot of the time. Neither Boris Johnson nor Keir Starmer is going to stop in a moment and say, well, actually, it seems like we have two different measures here and we're both technically right, and let's explain this to the public. What actually happens is that a lot of people leave that feeling very disengaged and being more distrustful of politicians overall. And then some political points are scored between A and B. And I think that we can make much better use of the data that we have already and communicate it more clearly and make room for the complexity and the nuance. We're very good at communicating complex things. I think as a species, we're storytellers. We can tell complex stories. It's just that we haven't actually made that effort when it comes to statistics and data.
Difficult to get people to understand, the people you're advising to both understand and be able to communicate some of these quite complex data things. There have been, for our visitors overseas who aren't in the UK, there's been quite a kerfuffle in the UK recently about some of the ways in which data has been presented at some of our prime ministerial press conferences, with people saying it's quite difficult to read, quite difficult to understand quite what the point is. What are the, do we have the skills, capabilities, and indeed the quality of political debate, picking up a point from Paul Wood here, political debate to enable us to have quite a sophisticated conversation about data internally and externally.
Can I just check that came to me because the sound cut out at the beginning?
Yeah. Now it's coming to you first of all.
Sounded like it would do. There's
Sorry, Laura.
No worries. There's nothing that Mevan said I disagreed with. I think she was pretty much bang on about everything there. We do need to do a much better job of communicating numbers. There is often a lot more work that can be done around error bounds and degrees of uncertainty. And I think that the way those sorts of things are communicated is something that we really need to look to improve. I'm obviously new in this environment, and I come from a background that's quite strongly around public communication of science, and it's something I feel very strongly about. So it is a process that I'm certainly very keen to get sort of more involved with. I think that a pandemic situation does make it very difficult because very often decisions have to be made very quickly. We're looking at systems that are built on models, and the models are inherently uncertain, not just because that's the way that models work, but also because the target moves very quickly in this sort of circumstance. The data is difficult to measure. It's difficult to make sure we're measuring the right thing. And when people are essentially in a rush, I think the finer points of communication can be lost more than they would normally be. But yes, I think that there is a much better way to communicate a lot of this data, and I think that's something we do need to be focusing on at the moment.
So, Aidan, we've been focusing
Jill.
a bit too much about the UK. What's the position like in Tanzania? How would you describe the experience of your government senior officials about communicating with data during the pandemic?
Yeah, well, it is a tough one. Look, in Tanzania, we decided we're not going to communicate any data whatsoever at all about the pandemic, which for me is a shame. It's a mistake. But there we are. We are now having to live with COVID-19 purely from an anecdotal position, you know. But luckily, I think, again, anecdote is showing that our case fatality rate, even our cases, may not be at all at the kind of exponential levels that other parts of the world are experiencing. So I think we've been very lucky. But I think to the point of communicating data that you asked, I just wonder, maybe ask my panelists, should it be the monopoly of political leaders to communicate complex data? You know, I follow and I listen and I watch really great communicators of data and statistics in the UK. Tim Harford is one. Jim Al-Khalili, the physicist, is another one. Marcus the Sotoy, mathematician, is another. Why can't we get these three in a room to advise Laura and the government on how to tell great and truthful stories with all the nuance that you require for people to be able to understand and therefore take responsibility for acting on correct data? I honestly think it should not be the monopoly or the purview purely of political leaders to communicate complex data. The temptation to take an objective truth and turn it into a political truth is just sometimes way beyond some of our politicians.
Well, we've got loads of questions coming in now, but I just wanted to ask Laura just very quickly on that. Do you think that the government, government should find different ways of communicating? We've seen a bit of a development with some of the sort of press conference use of slides. Someone suggested that we should use slides in Parliament. Probably a bit too radical. But do you see ideas there about how actually we can better convey information to the public, and in particular uncertainty?
I mean, definitely, yes. I think that's something that we're working very hard on at the moment. There is a slightly separate question of how do you communicate the data to decision makers. We are working towards a switch to more visual engagement at the moment. So we are starting to work on modeling dashboards, things where you can tweak the input and see how it affects the output. And that turns out to be, I think, a much more effective way of communicating with decision makers who aren't necessarily numerical by training, the effects of decisions that they make. And that's a huge ongoing movement at the moment. It's obviously very recent. We're a new team, but that's something that we're spearheading quite heavily. When it comes to communicating to the public, there are very clear ways in which things could be improved. Some of them are technological. It's easier to communicate the meaning behind a slide if you can stand next to it and point to the bits you're talking about even. So I think there's some room for a technological improvement in the way things are presented. A bit less next slide, please, which tends to go down quite poorly. And there's also, this idea of storytelling. And I think that the way that it would be nice if we moved the situation is to figure out what is the thing we're trying to communicate and then build the slides around that, rather than show the slides that perhaps the scientists use to make their determinations. It's something that we do feel pretty strongly about, and we are going to be working hard on.
Okay, let's move on. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in now about privacy and how government tells the public how it's using their data. So a couple here, one from Armel Skatulski, that's right, Armel, about, how does the government see their responsibility in better informing UK citizens, but let's globalize that to citizens and residents, about how government's using their data. A particular example they pull out is algorithm-led governance. Algorithms are indeed a bit of a buzzword around here that people are a bit concerned about. And another concern, again, from Armel, about the protection of records that are being used. I think, Laura, you were mentioning where two seemingly anonymized, harmless data sets could actually expose people when mashed together. And one from Peter de Jager about, actually, is there a technology to track what is being done with your data if it's shared? Mevan, do you have any views on any of this? Is the government good enough at communicating what it's doing with your data and how it's using it?
I think it might be a question best for Laura, to be honest.
Okay. Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure. So there are a lot of laws in place around data privacy and what it's acceptable to do with data. My background is largely in medical data, which is obviously very strongly protected. I do have a very strong belief in protecting people's privacy around data. I also have a very strong belief that it's very difficult to make progress if you can't get your hands on decent data sets. So I think that people try very hard to follow the rules. Sometimes that sort of inherently causes a problem in that it makes data less accessible. And the way that we're intending to sort of improve the situation there is to make sure that we collect a lot more anonymous data sets with people fully informed, up front, that they fully consented to, and that those data sets are essentially anonymous from the source. That's very useful for anything where you need to do scientific discovery. And we're certainly looking towards a future where those data sets are public, shared, can be used for other people to, design their own algorithms and double check models that perhaps we might be relying on. Models from more sources are better than fewer. And you will see with COVID that we're using quite a few models from different sources, different universities particularly, and they all have access to the same data and yet come out with different answers. So it's always a little bit harder than it looks, but it's a crucial area to both keep people safe. But without data sharing, we're not going to progress. So it certainly helps us if people have a more open view to sharing their data in a safe way, and we need to make sure that they feel protected doing that, I think. Which
so,
more
Aidan,
transparent.
Is this a debate that, Aidan, is this a debate that resonates at all in Tanzania, the debate about privacy and what does government do with my data?
Yes, it is. We don't have any data privacy laws in Tanzania. The government has free reign on what it can access in terms of, for example, our mobile phone networks. I think they all are under, whether it's public or not, instruction to provide what it is that government needs and wants in terms of data and what is being communicated. So people are very much using VPN to access the internet in a safe sort of way. In Kenya, they do have a Data Privacy Act. I think it's fairly recent, maybe a year or less to go with it. But also because I think the general population probably, I don't know whether it's different in the UK, is not hugely exercised by the privacy of their data. And so there isn't a really huge push from the population to get data protection. I think this is something probably that is the purview of people in the techie or in the human rights or governance fields who want to circumscribe the ability of government to use private data in dangerous ways for particular individuals or communities or organizations. But otherwise, it is not. It resonates, yes, but maybe amongst a very thin group of people, not so much a popular discussion yet.
That's very interesting. Laura, do you think that's true in the UK too, that actually the population's much less fussed about data privacy than quite a lot of campaigners, and actually if they thought it was for the public good, they'd be quite relaxed about it?
I'm not certain I'm qualified to answer that. My sense is that people are quite worried about data privacy. I think because the number of data breaches from companies has sort of gone up. You know, we saw data breaches around Zoom, Adobe. You know, I've had my Amazon account hacked because I didn't change my password after a data breach. And the more of those sorts of things that occur, I think the more people start to worry about it. There's also a sense, I think you have to trust that the government's attempting to use your data for good. And if a tabloid published something suggesting that the government was using your data to, you know, disadvantage you, that would, I think, severely impact our ability to get hold of any useful data at all. So we do have to be more careful rather than less, even if we think that people might be quite tolerant, is my sense, but I'm really not the expert there.
And just final question to you on this, and I'm going to come to one with Mevan, a different question, Mevan. But Laura, do you think we've had a lot of concerns in the UK about things being done by algorithm? We had this for people not in the UK. There was a sense in the summer that awarding exam grades by algorithm led to quite a lot of problems. And the Prime Minister talked about a mutant algorithm. Do you think that algorithms are a bit of a lost cause, or what can you do to rehabilitate the reputation of algorithms?
No, I do not think algorithms are a lost cause. I think that algorithms are very much the future. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how helpful things like mutant algorithm is as a phrase. It's an algorithm that, not to pick that particular example, but a poorly designed algorithm can be incredibly damaging. The responsibility is on the researcher and the people using those algorithms to interpret whether or not they are being made correctly and used correctly. You can always have a situation, I mean, you saw in the States a number of algorithms that, for example, were AI algorithms that were tuned on recidivism data and decided from the data that they were fed in that Black people should never be let out of prison or something to that extent. They can be horribly badly designed. If they're built wrongly, if they're tuned wrongly, if the people building them don't understand what they're doing, you can have an algorithm that does a great deal of harm. But it's not in itself, they're morally neutral. It's a tool, a bit like if you build a house and you do a terrible job and it falls over and kills people, that is the fault of the person who designed and built that house. So there is not an inherent problem with algorithms. There is a hugely powerful branch of mathematics. It enables us to treat diseases, to prevent people falling, to teach people to recover from strokes, to do space exploration, to scan the side of buildings to find out whether or not they're in any structural risk. They're positive and powerful if you do it right, and they can be very damaging if done wrong. But I morally neutral and an absolutely invaluable tool from where I'm sitting.
I think the Prime Minister probably used his mutant algorithm phrase before you were in number 10, Laura. So we'll look to a change of language there.
No,
Mevan.
It's sort of very evocative. It just you don't blame the algorithm, blame the people that designed it. I suppose.
Blame the author of the algorithm. Okay.
Yeah.
Mevan, I want to ask a slightly different question. We've had from Dave Thomas. Dave has pointed to the academic world has had to manage authenticity and trust for several centuries, done it through peer review and citations, key controls. Do those have a role to play in the digital information world in general? And is there a role for citizens in keeping governments, if you like, honest about data? And I think, I'll come and bring Aidan in as well about civil society organisations as well. What do you think? Can we have citizen data watch to make sure that we can have faith in data? Mevan.
So on academics and scientific literature, I think we have to acknowledge that still lots of it is locked away in privately owned companies. So that makes it obviously harder to access scientific research. But there are also a lot of papers that get retracted every year. So if you want a system that actually works really fast, in terms of authenticating and authentication and trust, although the scientific system is great, it's not one that works really fast. And in a situation like this, where we actually need to react really fast to new stimuli, pandemic is happening, we need more data, we need to react, then I'm not sure it's exactly the right thing. I would say on the privacy conversation, that's one of my general concerns, is the fact that we have to act very fast means that maybe we don't think about privacy as much at the end of the day. And the same about transparency, actually, they get lumped into this bucket of like, oh, they're just hard, we won't think about those. And I really think they should be front and center of all decisions that get made. On citizen science, or like citizen jury watches and stuff like that, we see more and more people helping us with our fact checking. So people are sending us tips of things that they're seeing on WhatsApp or family WhatsApp chats, which they get frustrated at, and then they send us, or they're seeing in like closed conversations online. And that actually informs our fact checking, because not all conversations right now are in the public domain. More and more of them are going to peer-to-peer conversations. So it's actually helping us target our fact checking so that we can take the most harmful pieces of information off the internet, or to make sure we have fact checks on them. So if people look for good information, then it's there and it's available to them. I think generally it's really hard to get people to volunteer, though, because there's a lot that takes precedent over that. And during a pandemic, it's especially hard to get people to volunteer, although we have seen millions of people do it.
Aidan, is there a role for civil society in keeping governments honest about data?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one area is, for example, budget and expenditure and tax collections and this kind of thing. But it requires that the government actually publish data that is good quality, believable, so that citizens can analyze, scrutinize, and comment on how government is performing. And the other piece, of course, is that citizens also generate data, sometimes passively, sometimes quite actively. And I think that citizen-generated data also ought to be in the equation when governments are considering policy, where they're evaluating success. And some of the work that Twaweza has been doing is to try and put that citizen-generated data, our surveys, our experiments, into the public domain to help decisions that the government is making around public service delivery.
Right, I've got quite a lot of questions about data in policy making. I want to come to all of things about, Anna Powell-Smith's asking, do we need systemic policy making reforms to help use data more, changes to official policy making guidance to include formal requirements to capture metrics or legislative reforms? But also a question from Carmen Ng about whether over-reliance on data might lead us astray in shaping public services, because basically we're driven by what the data tells us and miss out things. And somebody else was saying, what about the other bits, the qualitative stuff as well as the quantitative points of view? Laura, do you have a vision for what good data use in policy making looks like and what to be worried about?
Well, I'm very biased because I love a bit of data. We are driving, to Anna's point, driving quite a lot of system reform at the moment, really across government. It's something that's a great area of interest everywhere. The entire purpose for setting up the team that I'm heading up at the moment is to improve the use of evidence and to make that change. So it's something that has a lot of support, that people really believe in, and we have large numbers of initiatives that we're undergoing to make that happen, which we don't have time to go into in great detail. Certainly qualitative data and quantitative are useful side by side. There's a genuine measure, which is sort of social optimization. You don't just measure numbers around costs and expenditures. You measure quality of life quite often as a metric. And I think a lot of the way that you need to drive this sort of thing forward is to make sure that whenever there's a policy decision being made, and whenever money is put into something, that the things that you're measuring, the metrics, are agreed up front. You track them as you go along, and you chart how well or how badly, essentially, you're doing against the metrics that you've agreed. So that decision around what are the most important metrics to track success of any policy that you're implementing is hugely important. And one of the big things that we're trying to drive at the moment is more consideration between departments. So less siloed approach, really, to managing important sort of governmental decisions, maybe around, zero energy expenditure or, social and housing, these sorts of things. You can do a lot more if you start to pull data streams together about the downstream impacts of various policies on other departments. There's a lot we can do, and yes, it's not quantitative.
And do people in government, many of whom maybe were recruited in a age pre the biggest of big data? Is it? Sorry, I thought I had till 3.
Oh,
you want me to end it then? I'm lost. Sorry. Oh, right. Oh, I'm sorry, everybody. I thought we had till 3 for this session. It turns out we've only got till 5 to 3. So I've mistimed things. There were loads of questions we're going to come on to about data viz, things like that, but we haven't got time for that now. But I'm sure those are going to be picked up in the other sessions. And meanwhile, can you all virtually thank my fantastic panel there, Mevan, Laura, and Aidan, for giving their perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.